Number 1. Ancient nanotechnology. A European knight swings a massive iron broadsword. He is fighting with the brute force philosophy of the European Middle Ages. His weapon is essentially a sharpened crowbar weighing several pounds, designed to crush bone and shatter armor through sheer kinetic trauma. It is forged from local European iron, hammered flat in a rudimentary forge. But as the knight brings the heavy blade down, it is intercepted. An Islamic warrior raises a curved, impossibly thin scimitar to parry the blow. By all conventional rules of medieval metallurgy, the thin curved blade should snap in half under the crushing weight of the crusader's sword. It does not. Instead, the European blade chips. The Islamic warrior counters, and his thin sword slices effortlessly through the crusader's heavy chainmail, biting deep into flesh. As the crusader falls, he looks at the weapon that killed him. The surface of the thin blade is not smooth, polished silver. It is dark, swirling, and rippled, resembling flowing water frozen in metal. When the surviving crusaders returned to Europe, they brought back terrified whispers of this impossible metal. They called it Damascus steel. The legends that spread across Europe sounded like dark magic. European blacksmiths heard tales of Islamic swords that could slice a silk scarf falling gently in mid-air, yet were strong enough to cleave completely through a stone block or a European rifle barrel without losing a microscopic fraction of their edge. For centuries, the greatest metallurgical minds in Europe tried to copy it. They folded iron, they experimented with different quenching oils. They failed. The secret of Damascus steel remained a terrifying, impenetrable mystery until the year 2006. In a high-tech laboratory at the Technical University of Dresden in Germany, a team of crystallographers led by Dr. Peter Poffler decided to subject a 17th century Damascus sword to 21st century analytics. They extracted a microscopic sample from the ancient blade, dissolved a portion of it in hydrochloric acid, and placed it under a high-resolution transmission electron microscope. They expected to find a unique, perhaps cleverly folded alloy. What they found completely rewrote the history of material science. Deep inside the atomic structure of the ancient steel, the scientists observed microscopic tubes. They had discovered carbon nanotubes. And threaded inside those tubes were ultra-hard nanowires of cementite. To understand why this discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community, you have to understand what a carbon nanotube actually is. It is the holy grail of modern engineering. A carbon nanotube is a cylindrical molecule composed entirely of carbon atoms locked together in a hexagonal grid with walls that are exactly 1 atom thick. In the modern world, carbon nanotubes are considered a miracle material. They are roughly 100 times stronger than steel, yet incredibly flexible. They conduct heat and electricity better than copper. Modern aerospace agencies and military defense contractors currently spend billions of dollars trying to manufacture carbon nanotubes to build next-generation body armor, space elevators, and hyper-advanced stealth aircraft. According to every modern textbook, carbon nanotubes were officially discovered by a Japanese physicist named Sumio Iijima in 1991. We believe they were the exclusive triumph of advanced 20th century quantum chemistry. We were wrong by nearly 1,000 years. The ancient swordsmiths of the Middle East and India were manufacturing carbon nanotubes by the millions. They were engineering nanotechnology. How is this physically possible? How does a civilization with no electricity, no concept of atomic theory, and no microscopes synthesize the most advanced material on Earth? The answer lies in a staggering display of empirical chemical genius. The foundation of Damascus swords wasn't actually forged in Damascus. The raw material, known as wootz steel, was imported from specific, highly guarded mines in ancient India. The Indian metallurgists didn't just melt iron in an open fire. They engineered a closed-system chemical reactor. They placed the raw iron ore into a sealed clay crucible. But they didn't just add carbon. They added highly specific organic materials, leaves from the Cassia auriculata plant, woody stems, and sometimes even animal bone. They sealed the crucible entirely, depriving it of oxygen, and heated it in a specialized furnace to an exact thermal threshold of roughly 1,400 degrees Celsius. This is where the invisible magic happened. Because the crucible was sealed, the burning organic material created a highly pressurized, carbon-rich gas. The specific wootz iron ore from India contained microscopic trace elements of transition metals, specifically vanadium, chromium, and manganese. Inside the blazing heat of the crucible, These trace elements acted as chemical catalysts. As the steel cooled over several days, the carbon gas was forced to bond around the trace elements, initiating a process known today as chemical vapor deposition. The ancient smiths were literally forcing the carbon atoms to self-assemble into microscopic tubes, encapsulating the hard cementite wires. When the metal was finally taken to Damascus to be forged into swords, the blacksmiths utilized a highly specific, repetitive thermal cycling technique. They heated and hammered the blade at surprisingly low temperatures, which prevented the nanotubes from breaking down, aligning the nanowires into the stunning, watery bands visible on the surface of the blade. The flexible carbon nanotubes allowed the blade to bend up to 90 degrees without snapping. The ultra-hard cementite nanowires gave it an edge that could slice through European armor like butter. They had engineered the perfect weapon, a molecular hybrid of extreme flexibility and absolute hardness. And then, humanity lost it. By the mid-18th century, the production of true Damascus steel mysteriously ceased. The sword stopped appearing. The knowledge simply vanished. For years, historians blamed the secrecy of the blacksmiths, but modern science has revealed a far more terrifying truth about the fragility of human knowledge. The blacksmiths in Damascus didn't know they were making carbon nanotubes. They didn't know what vanadium or chemical vapor deposition was. They only knew the exact iterative steps required to coax the magic out of the Indian Wootz ore. But eventually, the specific mines in India that contained those exact microscopic trace elements of vanadium and chromium dried up. The ore ran out. The blacksmiths kept performing the exact same techniques. They used the same leaves, they built the same crucibles, they hammered at the same temperatures, but without the chemical catalyst hidden invisibly in the dirt, the nanotubes refused to form. The steel stopped rippling. The swords lost their magic. Because they didn't understand the underlying atomic chemistry, they couldn't adapt. They couldn't source the trace elements from somewhere else. The supply chain broke, and the greatest metallurgical secret in human history died. We didn't reinvent the carbon nanotube until 1991. We lost almost 3 centuries of technological progress simply because a single vein of dirt in India ran dry. It is a sobering tragedy of lost science. But a sword, no matter how microscopically perfect, is ultimately an instrument of individual combat. It kills one person at a time. What happens when an ancient empire applies this level of classified, high-level chemistry to a weapon of mass destruction? What happens when a civilization engineers a liquid that violates the natural laws of thermodynamics? A substance that burns on the surface of the ocean, incinerates entire invading navies, and is completely immune to water. In the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire engineered the ultimate chemical weapon. It saved Western civilization. And then they made sure the formula was permanently erased from the face of the earth. Number 2, the unextinguishable flame. The Byzantine Empire is on the verge of total annihilation. A colossal naval armada belonging to the Umayyad Caliphate has surrounded Constantinople. The Arab forces possess overwhelming numerical superiority. They are heavily armed, expertly commanded, and determined to breach the massive sea walls of the city. If Constantinople falls, the gateway to Europe is wide open. A small squadron of Byzantine dromons, fast, wooden galleys, sails out from the city harbors to meet the massive invading fleet. To the Arab commanders, this looks like a suicide mission. In naval combat of the 7th century, ships fought by ramming each other or boarding for hand-to-hand combat. A few Byzantine ships cannot possibly win a war of attrition. But as the Byzantine galleys close the distance, they do not ready their boarding planks. Instead, the Arab sailors notice something strange on the bows of the approaching ships. A heavy bronze tube, shaped like the head of a roaring lion, extends from the front of each Byzantine vessel. Behind the tube, a team of engineers is furiously pumping a complex mechanical lever. Suddenly, a deafening hiss cuts through the salt air. A pressurized jet of dark, viscous liquid erupts from the bronze lion's mouth. As it leaves the nozzle, it instantly ignites into a blinding, roaring stream of liquid fire. The fire arcs across the sky and strikes the Arab warships. The wooden hulls instantly combust. The sails disintegrate into ash. Panicked sailors desperately dive into the ocean to escape the flames. But the horror has only just begun. As the blazing liquid hits the surface of the Sea of Marmara, it does not go out. It floats. And worse, the moment it touches the salt water, the chemical reaction violently intensifies. The fire spreads across the surface of the ocean, turning the sea itself into a boiling, inescapable inferno. When the desperate Arab sailors attempt to throw buckets of water onto their burning decks, the water acts like gasoline, causing the flames to violently explode and spread further. When they try to smother it with sand, the chemical matrix simply burns right through it. It is an apocalyptic weapon. It is a fire that feeds on water. In a matter of hours, the technologically superior Byzantine fleet incinerates the invading armada. They deploy the weapon again in 717 AD during the Second Arab Siege, completely breaking the back of the Umayyad navy. The weapon becomes known to history as Greek fire. It saved the Byzantine Empire. It arguably saved all of Western Europe from premature conquest, and it instantly became the most highly classified state secret in the history of the ancient world. To this day, modern science does not know exactly what it was. We know what it did, but the precise chemical formula and the mechanical delivery system were so heavily guarded that when the Byzantine Empire finally collapsed, the recipe was permanently erased from the face of the earth. However, by utilizing modern chemical thermodynamics, defense engineers have attempted to reverse engineer the nightmare. If you ask a casual historian what Greek fire was, they will tell you it was crude oil. That is incorrect. While liquid petroleum, or naphtha, was undoubtedly the highly flammable base of the mixture, petroleum alone does not explain the physics of the battle. If you spray crude oil onto a ship and ignite it, it will burn. But if you spray crude oil onto a ship and a sailor throws a bucket of water on it, the oil will not spontaneously explode. For the fire to violently react and intensify upon contact with water, the Byzantines must have engineered a hypergolic reaction. A hypergolic reaction occurs when two distinct chemical substances spontaneously ignite upon contact with one another, or upon contact with a catalyst like water without requiring any external spark or flame. Modern chemists theorize that an architect and chemist named Callinicos of Heliopolis, a Syrian refugee who fled to Constantinople and invented the weapon, must have possessed a terrifying mastery of chemical synthesis. Callinicos likely introduced quicklime, calcium oxide, and calcium phosphide into the naphtha mixture. Here is the chemical genius. Calcium phosphide is relatively stable when kept perfectly dry. But the exact microsecond it comes into contact with water, it undergoes a violent phase change. It begins to release phosphine gas. Phosphine gas spontaneously combusts when exposed to oxygen in the atmosphere. When the Byzantine engineers sprayed this mixture, the moment it hit the damp wood of an enemy ship or the surface of the ocean, the water itself acted as the ignition switch. It was an ancient, self-igniting napalm. But chemistry alone does not win a war. You have to deliver the payload. And the delivery system of Greek fire is a mechanical anomaly that shouldn't exist in the 7th century. Imagine the catastrophic danger of this weapon. You are standing on a wooden galley, bouncing on the unpredictable waves of the ocean. In the hull of your ship, you are storing hundreds of gallons of a liquid that will spontaneously explode if it gets wet or exposed to the air. How do you safely launch a hypergolic fluid 50 feet through the air without blowing up your own ship? You have to engineer a pressurized, closed system flamethrower. Historical texts explicitly describe the Byzantine engineers heating the liquid in heavy bronze vats beneath the deck to lower its viscosity, making it flow easier. They then use a complex dual-action force pump, a piece of technology requiring airtight, industrial-grade pneumatic seals, to build immense atmospheric pressure inside the vat. When the operator opened a highly calibrated bronze valve, the pressure violently expelled the liquid up through the metal siphon on the bow. This required a profound understanding of fluid dynamics, pressure regulation, and mechanical metallurgy. If the pneumatic seal failed, the pressure dropped and the liquid wouldn't launch. If the bronze valve jammed while the liquid was being heated, the vat would become a pressurized bomb, instantly vaporizing the Byzantine crew. It was a 7th century weapon system that required 19th century industrial mechanics. So, how did a weapon this advanced completely vanish from human history? The Byzantine emperors realized that if their enemies ever acquired the formula for Greek fire, Constantinople would burn. So, they instituted a security protocol that mirrors the compartmentalization of the modern nuclear Manhattan Project. The creation of the weapon was broken down into isolated silos. The engineers who forged the bronze siphons were never allowed to see the force pumps. The men who built the pumps never saw the chemical vats. The soldiers who aimed the weapon never knew how to load it. And the chemical formula itself was divided. The alchemists who refined the naphtha were completely isolated from the chemists who synthesized the calcium phosphide. Only a handful of individuals in the entire empire, perhaps only the emperor and the descendants of Callinicos, knew the complete unified sequence. It was the ultimate security system, and it was deeply, fatally flawed. Over the centuries, as the Byzantine Empire slowly fractured through civil wars, assassinations, and economic collapse, those highly restricted supply chains broke. If the specific family that knew how to synthesize the quicklime was killed in a political purge, the entire weapons program halted. If the master metallurgist who cast the airtight bronze valves died of a plague, the pumps could no longer hold pressure. By hiding the knowledge so perfectly from their enemies, the Byzantines successfully hid the knowledge from their own descendants. By the time the Ottoman Empire finally breached the walls of Constantinople in 1453, bringing an end to the Roman Empire, the defenders on the walls did not have a single drop of Greek fire left. They had completely forgotten how to make the weapon that had saved their city 800 years earlier. The unextinguishable flame was extinguished by the very secrecy designed to protect it. The Byzantines used advanced chemistry and pressurized fluid dynamics to incinerate entire navies. It is a terrifying realization of ancient destructive capability. But what if you didn't need a pressurized bronze pump? What if you didn't need a hypergolic chemical payload? What if, hundreds of years before the invention of Greek fire, a single mathematician looked at an invading fleet and realized he could incinerate them using a force that was completely invisible, completely intangible, and possessed infinite range? The Romans were about to learn a terrifying lesson in applied thermodynamics. They were about to be struck by a weapon made entirely of light. Number 3, weaponized optics. The Roman Republic is executing a massive naval siege. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a legendary general known as the Sword of Rome, has anchored a fleet of heavily armed quinqueremes just off the coast of the Greek city-state of Syracuse. The Roman ships are massive, terrifying floating fortresses packed with elite legionaries and heavy siege engines. Marcellus is a seasoned tactician. He orders his fleet to anchor precisely a bowshot away from the city walls. They are mathematically out of range of the Greek archers. They are safe. They can take their time to starve the city out. But suddenly, a blinding, localized glare hits the lead Roman warship. It is not a projectile. It is completely silent. Within seconds, the sailors on the deck feel an unbearable, blistering heat. The thick black pitch used to waterproof the wooden hull begins to bubble and boil. The wood begins to smoke. 10 minutes later, without a single flaming arrow being fired, the massive Roman warship spontaneously erupts into a roaring inferno. Panic rips through the fleet. The Romans are the greatest military engineers on the planet, but they are completely helpless. You can block an arrow with a shield. You can extinguish a chemical fire with sand, but you cannot block a weapon made entirely of light. High above the harbor, standing on the fortified sea walls of Syracuse, is a 75-year-old mathematician, Archimedes. He is not using a bow. He is not using a catapult. He is using applied geometry and thermodynamics to weaponize the sun. For centuries, classical historians like Lucian and Galen wrote accounts of Archimedes incinerating the Roman fleet using burning glasses or a massive array of mirrors. During the Renaissance, figures like René Descartes completely dismissed the story as a mathematical impossibility. In modern times, popular television shows like Mythbusters famously tested the legend and labeled it busted, arguing that the weather conditions, the movement of the ships, and the time required to ignite the wood made it completely impractical on a chaotic battlefield. Because of this, pop culture wrote the Archimedes heat ray off as a fairy tale, but they were wrong. The physics are absolutely real, and modern scientific experiments have proven exactly how terrifying this optical weapon actually was. To spontaneously combust a wooden warship, you must raise the ambient temperature of the hull to its auto-ignition point, roughly 300 degrees Celsius, 570 degrees Fahrenheit. Archimedes understood that sunlight travels in parallel rays. If you stand on a wall holding a flat, polished bronze shield, you will reflect a 1-to-1 ratio of sunlight. It will dazzle an enemy, but it will not burn them. However, if you arrange dozens or hundreds of polished bronze shields in a highly specific concave arc, a parabolic reflector, you fundamentally alter the behavior of the light. The parabola catches a massive area of solar radiation and forces all of those parallel rays to intersect at a single microscopic focal point. You are creating a localized solar furnace. In 1973, a Greek scientist named Ioannis Sakas grew tired of Western historians dismissing the genius of his ancestors. He decided to prove the math. Sakas traveled to the Skaramangas naval base outside Athens. He built a plywood-scale replica of a Roman warship, coated it in tar paint, exactly as the Romans waterproofed their hulls, and anchored it in the water 160 feet away from the shoreline. He did not use modern lasers. He simply lined up 70 Greek sailors on the pier. He handed each sailor a flat copper-coated mirror measuring 5 by 3 feet. He directed the men to angle their mirrors to form a crude, human-powered parabola, aiming the glare at a single point on the replica ship. When the 70 beams of light intersected perfectly, the ship did not take 10 minutes to smoke. It burst into roaring flames in a matter of seconds. Decades later, in October 2005, a group of engineering students from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, replicated the physics again. They used 127 small, 1-foot square mirror tiles aimed at a wooden boat. Even with this smaller array, operating in the suboptimal weather conditions of a New England autumn, they successfully achieved combustion. Archimedes did not have 127 tiny mirror tiles. He had the entire defending army of Syracuse, armed with hundreds of highly polished, massive bronze shields. By calculating the precise mathematical curvature required to focus the sun, Archimedes engineered the world's first directed energy weapon. He bypassed the heavy iron armor of the Roman legionaries by attacking their infrastructure with invisible thermal radiation. He proved that ultimate destructive power does not come from muscle or iron. It comes from the mathematical manipulation of the physical universe. But there is a fatal flaw with weaponized optics. It requires a cloudless sky. It requires the sun. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was a brilliant commander. After losing ships to the blinding heat, he realized the Greek weapon was entirely dependent on the weather. So, he changed the rules of the siege. He ordered the Roman fleet to attack at night. Under the cover of darkness, the heat ray was utterly useless. The massive Roman quinqueremes silently rode through the black water, closing the distance to the sea walls. Their goal was to press the ships directly against the stone fortifications, allowing the heavy Roman marines to scale the walls using ladders. As the ships bumped against the ancient stone in the pitch-black night, the Romans thought they had outsmarted the mathematician. They were wrong. Archimedes knew they would come at night, and he knew that if he could not use light to destroy them, he would have to use heavy mechanics. As the Roman sailors prepared to scale the walls, they heard the deafening, terrifying sound of massive wooden gears grinding in the darkness above. Thick iron chains rattled. Suddenly, a massive mechanical arm plunged down from the top of the wall and smashed through the wooden deck of the Roman warship. The ship suddenly lurched upward. The Romans were about to experience a mechanical monstrosity that defied the laws of gravity. They were about to be picked up, shaken, and dropped by a machine so terrifying, the history books simply called it the Claw. Number 4. The ship-lifting Leviathan. The Roman fleet advances in absolute silence. Under the cover of darkness, Marcus Claudius Marcellus has ordered his massive quinqueremes to row directly against the stone fortifications of Syracuse. The Roman marines stand on the decks, gripping their swords, preparing to scale the walls using specialized siege ladders. They believe the darkness has neutralized the Greeks' greatest weapon. Archimedes cannot weaponize the sun if the sun is not shining. The lead Roman warship softly bumps against the ancient stone wall. The siege is about to begin. But suddenly, the pitch-black sky above them groans. It is the terrifying, deep, grinding sound of massive timber under immense tension. Thick iron chains rattle in the darkness. Before the Roman marines can even raise their shields, a colossal iron grappling hook, shaped like the talons of a massive beast, plunges down from the top of the wall and violently crashes through the thick wooden deck of the quinquereme. The ship violently lurches. The Roman sailors panic, attempting to pry the iron hook out of the deck, but they are too late. Inside the city walls, out of sight, an immense counterweight is dropped. The entire 50-ton Roman warship is suddenly ripped from the ocean. The marines scream as the deck tilts vertically. Heavy siege engines, barrels of supplies, and armored men are violently thrown backward, plunging into the churning black water below. The massive wooden hull of the ship rises higher and higher into the air, suspended by a single, terrifying mechanical arm. Water pours off the keel in waterfalls. For a few agonizing seconds, the warship dangles in the night sky like a toy. And then, the invisible operators inside the city release the tension. The warship drops. It plunges back into the ocean with such catastrophic kinetic force that the hull instantly shatters upon impact. The ship capsizes, dragging the remaining crew to the bottom of the sea. To the surviving Romans watching from the other ships, this was not war. This was supernatural. The Roman historian Plutarch later wrote that the psychological terror inflicted by this machine completely broke the Roman army. The legionaries became so deeply traumatized that if they saw even a single piece of rope or a wooden beam protruding over the city walls, they would drop their weapons and run. screaming that Archimedes was about to unleash a monster upon them. The machine became known to history as the Claw of Archimedes. It was not magic, it was not a monster, it was a flawless execution of structural engineering and applied physics. To understand how a single machine could lift a warship, we must look at the mathematical obsession of its creator. Archimedes is the father of modern statics. He famously declared, "Give me a place to stand and a lever long enough, and I will move the world." The claw was his ultimate proof of that equation. A Roman king Kareem was a massive vessel. Fully loaded with men, armor, and ballistae, it weighed tens of thousands of pounds. To deadlift that weight using pure muscle is biologically impossible. But Archimedes didn't use pure muscle. He used mechanical advantage. The claw was essentially a highly weaponized defensive crane. It utilized a massive wooden beam swinging on a fulcrum, anchored deep within the stone fortifications of the city. But leverage alone was not enough to rapidly hoist a 50-ton ship out of the surf. To achieve the speed and power necessary to flip a warship, Archimedes deployed his other world-altering invention, the compound pulley. Archimedes was the first engineer to mathematically prove the mechanics of the block and tackle system. If you try to pull a 100-pound stone straight up with a single rope, you must apply 100 pounds of force. But if you thread that rope through a series of multiple interlocking pulleys, you distribute the load. The more pulleys you add, the more the required force exponentially drops, though you must pull the rope a greater distance. By threading heavy ropes through massive, reinforced bronze pulley blocks, Archimedes reduced the physical weight of a 50-ton Roman warship to a fraction of its true mass. Inside the city, safely hidden behind the massive stone walls, a small team of Greek soldiers, or perhaps a few oxen walking in a circle turning a wooden capstan, simply pulled a rope. The compound pulleys multiplied their physical strength by orders of magnitude. The massive lever arm extended over the wall. The iron hook, carefully designed to automatically catch and lock under the prow of a ship, dug into the timber. By combining the fulcrum with the block and tackle, Archimedes weaponized gravity. He used the Earth's own physics against the Roman invaders. The result was total tactical paralysis. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the Sword of Rome, was forced to completely abandon his naval assault. The greatest military force on the planet was utterly humiliated by a single 75-year-old mathematician manipulating invisible lines of force. Archimedes proved that you do not need a larger army to win a war. You only need a deeper understanding of mechanics. But history is a brutal, iterative process. The Romans did not conquer the known world by giving up when they encountered superior engineering. They learned from it. They adapted. They absorbed the mathematical genius of the Greeks and applied it to their own military-industrial complex. Archimedes relied on massive, building-sized macro-mechanics to defend a city. But a few centuries later, the Romans would take the concept of complex mechanics and shrink it down. They wouldn't build a machine to lift ships, they would build a machine to completely automate the process of killing. They were about to engineer a piece of technology that traded heavy, single strikes for continuous, mechanized, rapid fire. To do this, they had to invent a mechanical component so advanced it vanished after the fall of their empire and was not officially reinvented until the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. They were about to invent the chain drive. Number 5. The ancient machine gun defending a fortress against the Roman Empire was a psychological nightmare. The defenders crouched behind the high stone battlements, gripping their shields. They are waiting for the inevitable, terrifying rhythm of Roman siege artillery. Traditionally, a standard Roman ballista, a massive, torsion-powered crossbow, takes several minutes to fire. A crew of 3 men must manually winch the heavy string back, carefully load a heavy iron-tipped bolt, acquire a target, and release. It is devastatingly powerful, but it is slow. It gives the defenders time to peek over the walls, return fire, and duck back down before the next volley. But today, the rhythm is wrong. There is no pause. There is no reloading time. From the Roman siege camps below, a continuous mechanical cadence cuts through the battlefield. Thump, 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 thump. A relentless, uninterrupted stream of heavy iron bolts rains down on the battlements, pinning the defenders entirely. If a soldier dares to lift his head, he is instantly struck. The fire does not stop for 3 minutes. It does not stop for 5 minutes. The Romans are not firing a standard ballista. They have deployed a piece of mechanical automation that shouldn't exist for another 2,000 years. They are laying down, suppressing fire using an ancient machine gun. The weapon was called the polybolos, literally translating from Greek to multi-thrower. Originally conceptualized in the 3rd century BC by an engineer named Dionysius of Alexandria at the Arsenal of Rhodes, the technology was rapidly absorbed and deployed by the Hellenistic and Roman war machines. To a modern engineer, the polybolos is a terrifying anomaly. Before the Industrial Revolution, every single weapon in human history required manual, step-by-step reloading. A human had to pull a bowstring, place an arrow, and release. The polybolos eliminated the human variable entirely. It automated the sequence of killing. To understand how an ancient civilization achieved mechanized rapid fire, you have to look at the side of the weapon. A standard ballista operated using heavy levers and ratchets, but the polybolos utilized a mechanism that is the absolute cornerstone of modern industrial engineering. It used a flat link chain drive. If you look at the chain on a modern bicycle or the timing chain inside a modern combustion engine, you will see a series of interlocking flat metal plates pinned together to form a continuous, flexible loop. History textbooks will confidently tell you that the flat link chain drive was conceptualized by Leonardo da Vinci during the Renaissance and finally mass-produced during the European Industrial Revolution. Those textbooks are wrong by roughly 1,800 years. The ancient engineers constructed a continuous chain drive using precisely carved wooden and metal links looped over 2 pentagonal gears at the front and back of the weapon. This single mechanical loop synchronized the entire firing sequence. Here is how the ancient automation worked. A single Roman soldier stood behind the polybolos and turned a circular windlass, a crank, continuously in one direction. He did not have to stop. He did not have to aim. He just turned the wheel. As the gear rotated, the chain drive engaged. First, a metal lug attached to the chain pulled the heavy slider back, mechanically cocking the massive torsion bowstring. As the slider reached its maximum tension, the mechanism triggered a secondary action. Mounted directly on top of the weapon was a wooden hopper, a gravity-fed magazine loaded with dozens of iron bolts. The motion of the slider perfectly aligned a rotating cylinder, allowing a single bolt to drop flawlessly from the magazine into the firing groove. As the soldier continued to turn the wheel, the lug hit a release pin. The string snapped forward, launching the bolt at lethal velocity. But because the wheel was still turning, the chain kept moving, immediately pulling the slider back to start the entire process over again. Cock, load, fire, cock, load, fire. All powered by one continuous, uninterrupted circular motion. The polybolos stripped the complexity of artillery down to a single, idiot-proof mechanism. A completely untrained soldier could step up to the weapon, turn a crank, and lay down an overwhelming, mechanized field of fire until the magazine was empty. It was the ancient equivalent of the Gatling gun. The existence of the polybolos proves that the ancient Mediterranean world was standing directly on the precipice of an industrial revolution. They understood continuous kinetic motion. They understood chain drives, automated magazines, and gear ratios. If they had applied this flat link chain technology to water wheels or looms, they could have mechanized ancient factories. But they didn't. They built a machine gun and then they lost it. When the Roman Empire finally collapsed, overwhelmed by economic ruin and barbarian invasions, the highly specialized engineering guilds dissolved. The men who knew how to carve the precise pentagonal gears died. The blueprints describing the chain drive rotted in abandoned libraries. The barbarian armies that conquered Rome had no use for complex mechanical maintenance. They preferred the simple brute force of the broadsword and the standard bow. The chain drive vanished into the dirt. Humanity forgot about it. We went back to manually loading weapons for over a millennium. The polybolos was a mechanical masterpiece, but it had one major limitation. It was heavy. It relied on massive bundles of tightly wound animal sinew and horsehair, known as torsion springs, to generate its kinetic power. Because of this extreme physical tension, the weapon had to be built with a heavy, reinforced timber frame. It was a stationary siege engine locked into a fixed position. But what if you wanted to take this exact concept, the automated magazine and the rapid fire capability, and shrink it down? What if you wanted to hand a machine gun to a single walking infantryman? To find a civilization that successfully engineered a portable, semi-automatic weapon, we must leave the ashes of the Roman Empire and travel thousands of miles eastward, to 4th century BC China, where ancient engineers were actively trading raw, kinetic power for an overwhelming, terrifying rate of fire. Number 6. The gravity-fed semi-automatic. An infantry battalion is advancing across a muddy valley. They are highly disciplined, heavily armed, and marching in a tight formation. They know they are walking into the range of the enemy archers. But in traditional 4th century BC warfare, the mathematics of archery are highly predictable. A standard archer must reach into a quiver, nock an arrow, draw the string, aim, and release. A highly trained bowman can manage perhaps one shot every 10 seconds. A traditional crossbowman is even slower. To span a heavy crossbow, a soldier must place their foot in a stirrup and use their entire back to pull the heavy string into place. The advancing infantry knows that once the first volley hits, they have roughly 15 to 20 seconds of complete safety to sprint across the battlefield while the enemy desperately reloads. But as the first volley strikes, the silence does not follow. Instead of a pause, a terrifying mechanical clatter echoes across the valley. The sky instantly darkens again, and again, and again. A relentless, unending swarm of iron-tipped bolts shreds the advancing line. The infantry is completely pinned down. They are being struck by a volume of fire that defies the physiological limits of the human body. They are facing the Chuko Nu, the ancient Chinese repeating crossbow. For a long time, Western historians assumed that the concept of a portable, magazine-fed repeating weapon was a modern invention, perhaps originating with the lever-action repeating rifles of the 19th century American West. But in 1986, archaeologists excavating Tomb 47 at Qinjiazui in Hubei province, China, uncovered a perfectly preserved wooden mechanism dating back to the 4th century BC. It was a handheld semi-automatic weapon, engineered 2,000 years before the invention of the firearm. To understand the mechanical genius of the Chuko Nu, you have to understand the fundamental bottleneck of all projectile weapons. The bottleneck is the human hand. The time it takes to manually fetch a projectile, load it, and cock the weapon is wasted time. The engineers of the state of Chu decided to completely eliminate the human hand from the loading process. They built a crossbow with a rectangular wooden box mounted directly on top of the tiller. This box was a gravity-fed magazine. Inside, up to 10 wooden bolts were stacked directly on top of each other. But the true brilliance of the Chu Konu was how it tied the magazine to the firing mechanism. The entire weapon was operated by a single heavy wooden lever. When a soldier pushed the lever forward, the wooden magazine slid forward, mechanically dropping the heavy bowstring down into the firing catch. At that exact microsecond, gravity pulled the bottommost bolt from the magazine stack, dropping it flawlessly into the firing groove. When the soldier pulled the lever backward, it dragged the string to full tension. As the lever reached the absolute limit of its rearward travel, it mechanically tripped the sear. The weapon fired. Push forward to load and cock. Pull backward to fire. It was a flawless dual-action mechanical loop. There was no separate trigger to pull. There was no fumbling for ammunition. A single soldier could stand on a battlefield and cycle the lever back and forth with terrifying speed, emptying a 10-round magazine in less than 15 seconds. It was an ergonomic masterpiece. But like all feats of engineering, this incredible speed required a harsh physical compromise. You cannot have both extreme rate of fire and extreme kinetic power. Because the lever had to be operated entirely by the strength of a single human arm in rapid succession, the draw weight of the Chuko Nu was incredibly low. It lacked the crushing, armor-piercing kinetic energy of a traditional, heavy crossbow. If one of these small bolts struck a heavily armored enemy directly in the breastplate, it would simply bounce off. To modern eyes, a weapon that cannot pierce armor seems like a failure. But the ancient Chinese engineers were not trying to pierce armor. They were engineering an area denial weapon. The Chuko Nu was designed to flood a specific geometric zone with so much flying wood and iron that it became impossible for an enemy to advance without taking a superficial hit to an unarmored limb, a face, or a neck. And a superficial hit was all they needed, because the engineers paired their mechanized rate of fire with advanced biochemistry. The tips of the bolts were frequently coated in aconitum, commonly known as wolfsbane. It is one of the most lethal neurotoxins naturally occurring on Earth. When introduced into the human bloodstream, even from a minor scratch on a soldier's cheek, the alkaloid toxins violently attack the voltage-sensitive sodium channels in the heart. Within minutes, the victim suffers catastrophic ventricular fibrillation. Their heart simply short-circuits. There is no cure on an ancient battlefield. By combining a gravity-fed magazine with a biochemical payload, a squad of just 100 men armed with repeating crossbows could put 1,000 poison projectiles into the air in under 15 seconds. They created an impenetrable, lethal wall of continuous suppression. The Chuko Nu proved that human ingenuity could completely bypass the rigid, traditional limitations of combat. If a bow is too slow, you build a machine to cycle it. You change the rules of the weapon. But what if you applied that same radical, rule-breaking philosophy to the most basic, fundamental weapon of the ancient world, the sword. A sword, by its very definition, is a rigid piece of metal. Its lethality is derived entirely from its stiffness, allowing it to hold an edge and transfer kinetic force into a target. If a sword bends, it is considered a metallurgical failure. But in the ancient kingdoms of southern India, metallurgical engineers looked at the rigidity of the sword and saw a limitation. They decided to completely break the rules of solid-state physics. They engineered a weapon that traded rigid kinetic force for terrifying, unpredictable fluid dynamics. A weapon that flexes like a whip, but slices like a razor. A blade so incredibly dangerous to wield that if a warrior hesitates for a microsecond, the geometry of the weapon will collapse and they will decapitate themselves. Number 7. Fluid dynamics in steel. An ancient warrior stands completely surrounded by multiple attackers. He is practicing the ancient martial art of Kalari Payattu, one of the oldest and most violently efficient combat systems on the planet. But he is not holding a heavy iron broadsword. He is not holding a spear. Resting at his side is what appears to be a tightly coiled metallic ribbon. It looks like a belt. The attackers lunge forward with their shields raised and swords drawn. The lone warrior snaps his wrist. The metallic coil instantly unfurls. With a terrifying, high-pitched hum, the weapon explodes outward into 4 long, razor-sharp ribbons of steel. The warrior begins to spin, sweeping his arm in massive, continuous figure-8 patterns. The steel whips through the air in a blur, creating a literal dome of flying razor blades around his body. When an attacker attempts to block the strike with a heavy wooden shield, the physics of the weapon defy all logic. The steel blade hits the edge of the shield, but it does not bounce off. It physically bends around the shield, whipping into the attacker's blind spot and instantly severing the arteries in their arm. The attackers fall back in absolute terror. They are fighting a man wielding the urumi. It is a weapon that fundamentally breaks the laws of traditional metallurgy. To understand why the urumi shouldn't exist, we must look at the strict, unforgiving rules of ancient blacksmithing. For thousands of years, the creation of a sword was a delicate balancing act between 2 opposing physical properties, hardness and flexibility. If you add a massive amount of carbon to iron and heat treat it aggressively, you create a blade that is incredibly hard. It holds a razor edge that can slice through armor, but it becomes brittle. If you strike a rock, it shatters like glass. Conversely, if you reduce the carbon, the blade becomes flexible. It can absorb impact without snapping, but it is soft. It cannot hold an edge and it will permanently bend out of shape, a process known in physics as plastic deformation. A sword, by its very definition, is a rigid lever. It relies entirely on its stiffness to transfer the kinetic energy of the human arm into the target. The engineers of ancient India looked at this universal rule of metallurgy and completely discarded it. They decided to engineer a blade that behaved like a liquid. To achieve this, the Indian metallurgists had to master the microscopic threshold of elastic deformation. They synthesized a highly specific form of spring steel. Through an exhaustive, highly guarded process of thermal cycling, heating the steel to an exact glowing red temperature and quenching it in oil, they locked the crystalline structure of the metal into a highly stressed state. The result was a blade measuring up to 6 feet long, but scarcely thicker than a piece of heavy parchment. When swung, the urumi ignores the rigid mechanics of a lever. It utilizes centrifugal force. As the warrior spins the weapon, the mass of the steel blade is pulled outward. The razor-sharp edge stabilizes in the air, maintaining its cutting geometry perfectly. But the moment it strikes a solid object, the spring steel instantly undergoes extreme elastic deformation. It violently flexes, wrapping around the object before snapping perfectly back into its original, straightened shape without suffering any microscopic structural damage. They engineered a steel sword that moves with the fluid dynamics of a whip. But breaking the laws of physics comes with a terrifying, often fatal compromise. The urumi is widely considered by modern martial historians to be the most dangerous melee weapon ever created, not just to the enemy, but to the wielder. Think about the biomechanics of swinging a traditional rigid sword. If you swing a heavy broadsword and miss your target, you simply stop your arm. The kinetic energy of the blade stops when your wrist stops. The urumi does not stop. Because it operates on the physics of a flexible whip, the blade carries continuous angular momentum. If a warrior swings an urumi at full speed and attempts to suddenly stop their arm, the handle will stop, but the 6-foot razor-sharp steel ribbons will continue traveling at 80 miles per hour. They will immediately wrap around the warrior's own neck and decapitate them. To wield the urumi without killing yourself, you cannot fight in rigid, sudden strikes. You must constantly maintain the centrifugal force. The blade must never stop moving. The warrior must weave the steel ribbons in continuous flowing figure-8 patterns, carefully syncing the rotation of the blades with the footwork of their own body. They must become entirely subservient to the momentum of the weapon. If the warrior hesitates for a single microsecond, if they break the geometric flow of the dance, the physics of the weapon will instantly turn on them. Because of this extreme suicidal learning curve, the urumi was kept as a heavily guarded secret. In the ancient schools of Kalaripayattu, it was the absolute final weapon taught to a student, and only after decades of mastering every other physical discipline. When deployed correctly, the urumi was an unparalleled force multiplier. A traditional swordsman can only fight the man directly in front of him. But a master wielding a multi-bladed urumi creates a 12-foot diameter sphere of continuous razor-sharp fluid motion. It is mathematically impossible for multiple attackers to step inside that sphere without being sliced to ribbons. Furthermore, traditional defenses are completely useless against it. You cannot parry an urumi with another sword. If you try, the flexible steel will simply wrap around your parry and slice your face. You cannot hide behind a shield. The blade will wrap over the lip of the shield and sever your fingers. The engineers of ancient India achieved the impossible. They stripped the rigidity out of steel and forced solid metal to flow through the air like a liquid. They weaponized momentum. But what happens when an ancient empire takes this concept of weaponizing the intangible environment one step further? A flexible sword slices through the air, but the air itself is harmless. It is invisible. It is the very oxygen required for human survival. What if a civilization managed to alter the invisible chemistry of the atmosphere itself? What if they engineered a weapon that required no kinetic force, no sharp edges, and no physical projectiles? In 256 AD, deep underground, beneath the Syrian desert, the Roman military machine was about to encounter exactly that. They were about to be trapped in the world's first chemically engineered gas chamber. Number 8, the 256 AD gas chamber. It is silent, except for the rhythmic scraping of iron picks against stone. 30 feet below the Syrian desert, a squad of 19 elite Roman legionaries is navigating a narrow, suffocating tunnel. Above them is the heavily fortified city of Dura Europos. The city is under siege by the Sasanian Persian Empire. The Persians are digging a mine to collapse the city walls. The Romans are furiously digging a countermine to intercept them. The air is stale. The space is so tight the men can barely stand. Suddenly, the rock wall in front of the lead Roman soldier crumbles. They have breached the Persian tunnel. The Romans draw their short swords, preparing for brutal, close-quarters subterranean combat. But no Persian soldiers charge through the breach. Instead, a thick, unnatural, yellow-black smoke billows into the Roman tunnel. It moves too fast to be a normal fire. The Romans immediately begin to choke. They drop their weapons, clutching their throats. Their eyes burn with an agonizing, blinding pain. They turn to flee back up the narrow shaft, but the heavy smoke instantly fills the space, moving like a liquid. Within 60 seconds, all 19 Roman legionaries are dead. They are not burned. They are not crushed by falling rock. They are killed by a weapon that completely overwrites the rules of ancient warfare. They have just walked into a chemically engineered gas chamber. In the 1930s, French and American archaeologists excavating the ruins of Dura Europos discovered the collapsed tunnels. When they cleared the debris, they found the 19 fully armored Roman skeletons stacked in a horrific, tangled pile near the breach. For decades, the official academic consensus was that the Romans simply died in a tunnel collapse, or perhaps succumbed to smoke inhalation from a standard underground fire set by the Persians to destroy the wooden support beams. But in 2009, an archaeologist at the University of Leicester named Dr. Simon James re-examined the site and the chemical residue left on the rocks. He realized that a standard wood fire does not kill a squad of 19 highly trained, disciplined soldiers before they can run a few dozen yards back up a tunnel. The soldiers were stacked in a way that suggested sudden, catastrophic panic and immediate physiological failure. Furthermore, near the bodies, archaeologists had found a small blackened jar. When the residue inside the jar and on the surrounding tunnel walls was tested, it revealed trace amounts of bitumen, a highly flammable, thick crude oil pitch, and yellow crystals, pure sulfur. The Sasanian Persians didn't just light a wood fire to smoke the Romans out. They engineered a highly specific, toxic chemical reaction. When you burn sulfur and bitumen together in an enclosed space, you do not just get smoke. You trigger a chemical phase change that produces a highly concentrated, lethal cloud of sulfur dioxide gas, SO2. Sulfur dioxide is incredibly dense. It is heavier than the standard atmospheric air. The Persians understood this physics. They were positioned slightly higher in the tunnel network than the Romans. When the breach occurred, the Persians didn't just let the gas drift. They threw the sulfur and bitumen onto burning braziers and used large wooden bellows to actively pump the heavy, concentrated toxic gas downward into the Roman shaft. The heavy gas acted like a liquid, flooding the lower tunnel, displacing the oxygen, and completely trapping the legionaries. But sulfur dioxide does not just kill through asphyxiation. The lethality of the gas lies in how it interacts with human biology. When sulfur dioxide gas enters a human respiratory system, it violently reacts with moisture. The moment the heavy gas touched the tear ducts in the Roman soldiers' eyes, the saliva in their mouths, and the mucous membranes in their respiratory tracts, a catastrophic chemical reaction occurred. The gas bonded with the water molecules, H2O, inside the human body to instantly form sulfurous acid. The weapon was literally weaponizing the water inside the victims' own bodies. As the legionaries gasped for air in the darkness, they were pulling the gas deep into their lungs. The moisture inside their alveolar sacs instantly converted the gas into acid. Their lungs began to blister and dissolve from the inside out. The pain would have been absolute, paralyzing, and blinding. Their vocal cords would have chemically burned away, rendering them completely incapable of shouting a warning to the men behind them. They drowned in a mixture of their own blood and acid in a matter of seconds. The terror of this weapon is perfectly encapsulated by the discovery of a 20th body found alone on the Persian side of the breach. He was a Sasanian Persian soldier wearing chainmail, clutching his sword. He was the man ordered to stay behind, stoke the brazier, and pump the bellows to ensure the gas flooded the Roman tunnel. The concentration of the sulfur dioxide was so overwhelmingly lethal that despite being behind the fire, he was overcome by his own weapon and died alone in the dark. His commanders knew this would happen. He was a calculated, sacrificial casualty to ensure the chemical payload was successfully delivered. Once the gas cleared, the Persians calmly walked over the bodies of the Romans, set fire to the wooden support beams, and collapsed the massive stone wall of Dura Europos above. If you open a standard military history textbook, it will tell you that the horrors of chemical warfare, the deployment of toxic, suffocating gas to clear trenches and bunkers, was a grim invention of the 20th century. We point to the First World War, to the deployment of chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, as the dark dawn of weapons of mass destruction. We were late by 1,700 years. The Sasanian Persians were executing coordinated, multi-stage chemical warfare, complete with pressurized delivery systems and sacrificial operators, in the 3rd century AD. They had mastered the chemistry of suffocation. They proved that you do not need to swing a sword to wipe out an elite military unit. You just have to alter the invisible chemistry of the air they breathe. But chemistry is a versatile, terrifying science. Altering the atmosphere to suffocate an enemy is a masterpiece of biological area denial, but it is fundamentally passive. You are relying on the enemy to inhale the weapon. What happens when an ancient civilization takes a different set of chemicals, seals them in a tight cylinder, and discovers that chemistry can be used for something far more aggressive than suffocation? What happens when chemical engineering is used for propulsion? We have explored nanoscale swords, automated artillery, directed energy optics, and suffocating gas. But every single weapon in human history was about to be rendered completely obsolete by a single, terrifying breakthrough in 10th century China. The era of ancient warfare is about to end because humanity is about to build the world's very first firearm. Number 9, the genesis of the firearm. A heavily armored Jin soldier climbs to the top of a siege ladder. He is a veteran warrior, clad in thick, overlapping iron lamellar armor. He raises his heavy sword, preparing to vault over the stone battlement and slaughter the Song dynasty defenders. A Song infantryman steps forward to meet him. The Song soldier is holding a spear, but to the Jin warrior, the weapon looks absurd. Lashed to the wooden shaft, just below the iron spearhead, is a hollow tube of thick green bamboo. The Song soldier does not thrust the spear. Instead, he holds a smoldering piece of incense to a thin paper cord at the base of the bamboo tube. There is a sharp hiss. Then, the bamboo tube violently erupts. A roaring, 5-foot jet of localized chemical fire blasts directly into the Jin warrior's face. The blast is so intense it blinds him, but this is not just a flamethrower. Hidden inside the fiery jet is a payload of jagged porcelain shards, iron sand, and poison darts propelled at ballistic speeds. The Jin armor is completely shredded. The warrior is blown backward off the ladder, dead before he hits the ground. The Song soldier has just fired a Huotiang, a fire lance. He is holding the exact technological missing link between the ancient sword and the modern gun. The siege of Dian is one of the earliest, highly verified historical accounts of the mass deployment of chemical propulsion in combat. For thousands of years, wars were won by the civilization that could forge the hardest metal and breed the strongest men. The invention of the fire lance permanently broke that equation. But the terrifying irony of this weapon is that it was never supposed to be a weapon at all. It was the result of a catastrophic failure in medical chemistry. Centuries before the siege of Dian, Chinese Taoist monks were conducting intense chemical experiments. They were not trying to invent a bomb. They were actively searching for the elixir of life, a chemical compound that would grant human immortality. They began mixing various organic and inorganic minerals. Eventually, they combined three specific ingredients: crushed charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate saltpeter. When they exposed the mixture to an open flame, it did not grant eternal life. It violently exploded, burning down the laboratory and searing the skin off the alchemists' faces. They called the mixture Huo Yao, literally translating to fire medicine. Yeah, they had accidentally invented black powder, but raw black powder sitting in a pile is just a highly flammable dust. If you light a pile of it on the ground, it simply burns in a bright flash, known as deflagration. It is dangerous, but it is not a weapon of war. To turn chemical deflagration into a ballistic weapon, you must understand the physics of expanding gases. When black powder ignites, a rapid chemical reaction occurs. The solid powder instantly converts into hot, expanding gases. In a fraction of a microsecond, those gases expand to roughly 3,000 times the volume of the original solid powder. If this reaction happens in the open air, the gases harmlessly dissipate. But the Song Dynasty engineers did not leave it in the open air. They packed the powder tightly into a hollow bamboo tube and sealed the back end. When the powder ignited inside the bamboo, the massively expanding gases were completely trapped. They had only one avenue of escape: the open nozzle at the front. The bamboo tube acted as a pressure chamber, forcibly directing all of the explosive kinetic energy forward in a concentrated, high-velocity stream. They had engineered a directed energy thruster. By packing iron shrapnel, broken glass, and toxic darts into the tube on top of the powder, the Song engineers forced the expanding gases to push the solid mass out of the nozzle at speeds exceeding the speed of sound. They created the world's first shotgun. The fire lance is an evolutionary marvel because you can watch the technology adapt and mutate in real time through the historical record. Initially, the bamboo tubes were fragile. They could only be fired once. The extreme thermal shock and internal pressure of the expanding gases would scorch the bamboo, rendering it useless. The weapon was a hybrid. Once the tube fired its payload, the soldiers simply used the spearhead to stab whoever was left standing. But as the chemical engineers refined the black powder, making it burn faster and hotter, the expanding gases began to shatter the bamboo tubes completely, blowing the soldiers' hands off. The technology had outgrown its biological casing, so the weapon evolved. The engineers replaced the bamboo with tightly wrapped heavy parchment paper. Then, they replaced the paper with cast iron and bronze. Once the tube was made of heavy metal, the internal pressure could be increased exponentially. They could pack more powder. They could use heavy, solid lead spheres instead of loose iron sand. The lethal range extended from 10 feet to 50 feet, and then to 100 feet. And then the final, inevitable shift occurred. The metal tube became so heavy and so devastatingly powerful that the wooden spear shaft it was attached to became entirely obsolete. Why bother attaching a spearhead to a weapon that can kill an armored man from 100 feet away? The spear shaft was shortened into a wooden stock. The spearhead was removed entirely. The metal tube became the sole focus of the weapon. The fire lance evolved into the hand cannon. The hand cannon evolved into the musket, and the musket reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape of planet Earth. The true terror of the firearm was not just its kinetic power. It was its absolute democratization of violence. Before the firearm, becoming a lethal warrior required a lifetime of caloric investment. A European knight or a samurai had to train for 20 years to master the geometry of the sword, build the muscle mass required to wear 50 pounds of steel armor, and learn to ride a warhorse. They were elite, biological killing machines. The firearm rendered that 20 years of grueling, elite training completely irrelevant in a microsecond. A peasant who had been starving in a rice paddy his entire life could be handed a bronze tube, given 2 hours of instruction on how to light a fuse, and he could effortlessly shoot a master samurai off his horse from 50 yards away. Chemistry completely overwrote biology. The moment the Song infantryman lit the fuse on that bamboo tube in 1132 AD, the ancient world died. The era of the sword, the era of the armored knight, and the era of the master metallurgist was over. We had crossed a technological Rubicon. But as we look back across the timeline of these 10 impossible weapons, a haunting, terrifying pattern emerges. We have seen ancient civilizations manipulate matter at the nanoscale. We have seen them engineer robotic chain drives, synthesize unextinguishable liquid fire, and deploy chemical WMDs. And we have seen almost every single one of those technologies completely vanish into the dirt. What does this pattern tell us about our own future? Number 10. The Lost Library of War. Look back across the timeline. A piece of volcanic glass napped in the Mesoamerican jungle, parting human cells with an edge 3 nanometers thin. A glowing crucible in ancient India, forcing carbon atoms to self-assemble into microscopic nanotubes. A heavy wooden chain drive, clicking methodically outside the walls of an ancient Mediterranean fortress. A bronze lion's head, vomiting self-igniting, hypergolic liquid fire across the surface of the ocean. When you place these 10 weapons side by side, a deeply unsettling picture of human history emerges. We are taught from a very young age to visualize history as a straight, upward sloping line. We believe that humanity started in the dark, and through the slow, steady accumulation of knowledge, we climbed into the light of the modern age. We assume that technological progress is a permanent, irreversible guarantee. These 10 ancient weapons prove that the timeline is a lie. History is not a straight line. It is a jagged, violent waveform. It is a series of staggering, impossible peaks of scientific genius, followed by catastrophic, world-erasing collapses. Humanity has reached the mountaintop before, and we have fallen off. The most terrifying lesson of ancient warfare is not how brilliant our ancestors were. It is how easily their brilliance vanished. We look at our modern world, our skyscrapers, our global internet, our satellite networks, and we feel a profound sense of permanence. We assume that because we have mapped the human genome and split the atom, our civilization is invincible. But modern technology is actually exponentially more fragile than the technology of the ancient world. Think about why the ancient weapons were lost. Damascus steel vanished because a single, highly localized supply chain in India dried up. The blacksmiths knew the physical motions, but without the microscopic chemical catalyst hidden in the ore, the nanotechnology failed. Greek fire vanished because of the absolute terror of compartmentalization. The Byzantine emperors broke the formula into so many isolated, highly classified silos that when the empire fractured, the complete sequence was permanently erased. The secrecy designed to protect the weapon destroyed it. The flat-link chain drive of the polybolos vanished because it required an entire societal infrastructure of highly specialized mathematical guilds. When the Roman economy collapsed, the funding for those guilds disappeared. The men who knew how to carve the precise pentagonal gears starved, or were killed by invading armies who preferred the simple brute force of an iron sword. Now, apply those exact same vulnerabilities to the 21st century. Our entire modern world relies on microscopic trace elements, lithium, cobalt, rare earth metals, mined from highly volatile geopolitical regions. Our most powerful technologies, artificial intelligence algorithms, nuclear launch codes, stealth aerospace blueprints are heavily compartmentalized across classified defense servers. And our societal infrastructure is entirely dependent on a fragile, highly complex global power grid. If the Roman Empire could forget how to build a chain drive for 1,000 years, what happens if the modern supply chain snaps? If a catastrophic solar flare, a global cyber attack, or a kinetic world war knocks out the electrical grid, how much of our superior knowledge survives? The ancient Greeks and Romans carved their mathematics into solid marble. They forged their weapons in heavy bronze and iron. A polybolos gear or a Damascus blade can be buried in the dirt for 2,000 years, dug up by an archaeologist and reverse engineered. But our knowledge is digital. It exists as magnetic charges on fragile silicon platters and solid-state drives. If the power goes out and the servers degrade, our civilization leaves almost nothing behind. Within 100 years, the vast majority of our digital libraries, our scientific journals, and our engineering blueprints will simply evaporate into the atmosphere. Imagine an archaeologist 2,000 years in the future, excavating the ruins of a modern city. They won't find the blueprints for a Saturn V rocket or the source code for an artificial intelligence. They will only find the decaying, rusted husks of silicon chips and plastic screens. When that future civilization looks back at us, what will they think? Will they look at a piece of fiber optic cable and understand that we used it to beam data across the ocean at the speed of light? Or will they write it off as primitive, ritualistic jewelry? Will they believe that we walked on the moon? Or will they classify the Apollo missions as a religious fairy tale? The ancient weapons we explored today shouldn't exist. According to the standard model of history, they are anomalies. They are glitches in the timeline, but they did exist. They were real, and they were lost. The formula for Greek fire is gone. The recipe for Damascus steel is gone. The blueprints for Archimedes optics are gone. When the lights of our civilization finally go out, what piece of miraculous, everyday modern technology will become the myth of the future?